Welcome, wonderful students, to Lesson 30 of the Changing Economic World topic. In this lesson, we will be exploring the environmental impact of industry, of manufacturing. In the UK, although industry has decreased compared to in the past, it remains an important part of the UK's economy. And with industry comes potential environmental damage, air pollution, waste, and water pollution. What I'm going to show you today is how the UK has been effective in reducing the environmental impact of manufacturing. And you will see through this lesson how the UK has been more effective and why than Nigeria in its efforts to reduce the environmental effects of industry. Please write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Prior learning. Please write 1 to 10, answer the questions from memory and then mark your answers. Game time. Number 1. What word means a group of companies in the same industry working near each other? It's a cluster or a business cluster. 2. Most companies in science parks are in the quaternary sector. 3. An example of a science park in the UK is Cambridge Science Park. 4. Most science and business parks are located on the outskirts of cities to reduce congestion. 5. Productivity is the amount of value that a worker delivers in a certain amount of time. 6. The growth of science parks has been fueled by a rise in demand for technology. 7. Free trade means there are no trade barriers between countries. 8. Nigeria was a colony of the UK until 1960. 9. The primary sector is largest in LICs. And 10. Iceland benefits from being located in a tectonically active area because it gets geothermal energy from the hot rocks underground. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or above, you've really understood the last few lessons on this topic. Any questions you got wrong, write them as a question and then write the answer and test yourselves on them repeatedly until you've memorized them. Excellent. To introduce this lesson, I'm going to help you to think about the idea of environmental laws, and I'm going to ask you to compare what the UK has to what Nigeria had. In the lesson on Nigeria's environment, we discussed the weakness of the environmental laws there. I'm going to show you some questions, and I want you to answer them using the best of your knowledge. So this is the symbol we use for environmental laws. Here are your questions. So number 1. Does Nigeria have effective environmental laws? And by effective environmental laws we mean, does Nigeria effectively protect its environment from development and from human activity? Well, the answer to that question is mostly no. Although it does have environmental laws, they're not enforced very strongly. 2. Why is there increasing amounts of waste pollution in Nigeria? Well, you could have said some of the following things. Population growth, rising incomes, more manufacturing. These are the ideas that are related to waste pollution in Nigeria. 3. Why are Nigeria's environmental laws often ineffective? They're ineffective because they are not strongly enforced, because there's a shortage of police, because government corruption means that not enough money has been invested in enforcement, because there is a shortage of infrastructure and facilities to enforce the environmental laws. For example, recycling facilities or water treatment facilities or efficient vehicles for manufacturing companies to buy or to use. This is why environmental laws are ineffective. Additionally, regulators, which means people who monitor environmental pollution, are either weak or corrupt and unable to measure exactly how much businesses and people are polluting. 4. How might the UK's laws be different? What effect would this have on environmental damage? Well, you may have said that the UK's laws may be stronger or more strongly enforced than Nigeria's. And what effect would this have on environmental damage? Well, it may lead to reduced environmental pollution. In the lesson on Nigeria, we discussed about the number of people who are dying every year from air pollution per 100,000 people, and I told you that it was about 7 times higher than the number from the UK. You may also know, if you've ever been to a beach in England, that they tend to be quite clean. The rivers also tend to be quite clean. So these are the effects of having strong environmental laws. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how manufacturing can cause environmental damage in the UK and how it did in the past. And I'm also going to show you some of the effective ways that the UK's government and people have managed to reduce those effects so that we live in a cleaner, less polluted country. So the big question, why does manufacturing cause environmental problems? Well, here is manufacturing. And there are two sides to this question. On the one side, you have the inputs of manufacturing, the things that go in that allow manufacturing to happen. And on the other side, you have the outputs, the things that come out of manufacturing, the pollution. One of the most important inputs of manufacturing is electricity. All manufacturing today requires electricity to run the machines, to all kinds of things, to run the computers. Every process in manufacturing requires a lot of electricity. Therefore, we say that manufacturing is energy intensive. It uses a lot of electricity to run it. In the UK, not all of our electricity supplies come from renewable energy. Some of it comes from fossil fuels. For example, natural gas. Almost 40% of the UK's electricity supplies come from natural gas. This means that industries that are energy intensive have a high carbon footprint, which means they produce a lot of carbon dioxide simply by the fact that they require a lot of electricity. Additionally, industry requires lots of raw materials like metals and plastics that it uses to manufacture products. Sometimes these raw materials require environmental damage to extract. For example, metals often require deforestation to dig up out of the ground. As a result, the inputs of manufacturing in the UK can be quite environmentally damaging. Air pollution, carbon dioxide, which leads to global warming because it's a greenhouse gas, and often deforestation. But there are also the outputs, and this is key. And this is the area where the UK has really succeeded in reducing the environmental effects of manufacturing. First output is water pollution. Some of the processes involved in manufacturing involve using liquid chemicals to make things happen. For example, polishing the metals on iPhones or on cars often uses harsh chemicals that are, without strong environmental laws, released into rivers, which can cause devastating environmental damage, killing fish, contaminating our water supply. This used to happen in the past a lot, and it led to filthy rivers and the sea around the UK's coasts being polluted and biodiversity being much lower than it is today. Water pollution. Second output is waste. When manufacturing gets its inputs, the plastics, the metals, the rubber, the wood, all kinds of things that go into making a product, not all of those materials are used. And so the parts that aren't used, the scrap metal, scrap plastic, scrap wires, get thrown out. If a company and a country is not careful, this ends up in big landfills as waste. Sometimes the waste gets blown into the sea or washed into the sea by rain, or through rivers. Sometimes it seeps into the ground and it contaminates the ground and causes soil pollution, which makes farming more difficult and can contaminate water supplies. Waste pollution is another problem. Is this: manufactured products are often sold very far away from where they are manufactured. For example, the UK exports many thousands of cars every year. To transport these cars requires vehicles that often cause air pollution. When products like speakers or toothbrushes or any manufactured product are transported from one part of a country to another, they're transported usually in lorries that are polluting. Lorries often use diesel fuel, which when burned and used as a fuel releases harmful chemicals, not just carbon dioxide, but also nitrogen dioxide, which causes asthma and lung problems. Air pollution, therefore, because of the transport of manufactured goods, is another output and environmental problem. So if a country doesn't have environmental laws, these three outputs can be very serious, as you saw in the case of Nigeria. And if a country relies on fossil fuels, then the inputs also cause serious environmental problems in the form of carbon dioxide leading to global warming. So what has the UK done to mitigate this environmental impact? And mitigate means reduce. Let me show you. It's all based on strong environmental laws. And when I say a strong environmental law, I mean one that is enforced. In a school, if you get a detention, if it's enforced, that means you have to do the detention. Otherwise, getting a detention means nothing. It won't affect your behavior won't improve. If you drive too fast on a motorway, you get a speeding fine. If you don't get a speeding fine, then people will drive too fast because they know they won't be punished. Enforced environmental laws are what control and improve behavior, and they are the most powerful way to reduce environmental pollution from industry. In the UK, there are 3 environmental laws that have been particularly important, and I'm going to show you what they are and how they have reduced the environmental impact of industry. The first one relates to air pollution from energy production. The UK, until recently, was part of the European Union, and one of the laws that was created was called the 2020 Climate Change Act, and it meant that by 2020 the UK would reduce its CO2 emissions by 20% compared to the amount of CO2 it released in 1990. This was a very ambitious goal, and to achieve it the UK had to commit to using more renewable energy. In the resources topic that we have learned, or that you will learn if you watch the video on it, you will know that the UK has invested significantly in renewable energy and has reduced the amount of fossil fuels that it uses. Additionally, companies are subsidized to support their use of investment in renewable energy. A subsidy means that a company is paid so that investing in renewable energy is cheaper. Here's an example. The Jaguar Land Rover factory in the UK, one of the biggest car factories in the world, has installed an enormous number of solar panels, more than 5.5 megawatts worth of solar panels on its roof. It did this because subsidies from the government made it cheaper to do so. As a result, 30% of Jaguar's electricity supply for its manufacturing of its cars comes from solar power. This has reduced the company's carbon footprint. And it did so because an environmental law called the 2020 Climate Change Act encouraged the UK's government to help businesses reduce their carbon footprint through the investment of renewable energy. That's one example of an environmental law. But the input, energy use, is not the only environmental effect of industry. There's also waste. So how has the UK reduced that? Well, to reduce waste that goes into the environment in landfills and into the sea and rivers, you need to recycle it. Recycling, however, can be expensive. You need the right infrastructure, the right buildings and facilities and machinery to be able to recycle. So companies don't always do this by themselves because it costs a lot, which means their profits would decrease. A law in the UK called the Environmental Protection Act, which was created in 1990, fined companies for producing too much waste, which means they had to pay money for producing too much waste and sending it to landfills. As a result, the companies now had a reason to recycle more because they knew that it would save them money. It would be cheaper to recycle than to have a fine. Additionally, the United Kingdom's government invested in recycling facilities, for example this one, which helped companies to recycle more easily and more cheaply. Recycling also is profitable for companies. This is the Jaguar Land Rover recycling facility at the same factory. Much of their waste metals and plastics are recycled on site and reused in new cars. This means that Jaguar Land Rover needs to use fewer materials in the production of its new cars, so it saves money and makes more profit. 90% of Jaguar's waste products are recycled because of the incentives created by the Environmental Protection Act in the UK. So the story so far is the fact that strong environmental laws encourage businesses to be environmentally friendly, because if they aren't, it costs them money. And they know that they will be fined if they break the law. That's called a strong environmental law. Third problem of industry is water pollution. Companies will naturally let their wastewater flow into rivers because that's the cheapest thing to do. In Nigeria, the Niger River is heavily polluted outside the main cities because weak environmental laws mean that companies do not have to treat all their water. They don't have to clean it before it goes into the river. Similarly, in China and in India, there are some of the most polluted rivers in the world. In the Yangtze River, near some of the biggest cities, the river is said to be dead, biologically dead, which means there are no living species of fish. This is because the water is so polluted with harmful chemicals from manufacturing. In the UK, the Environmental Protection Act, which also reduces waste pollution, acts to force companies to treat, which means clean their wastewater before it's allowed to go into rivers. And this is done through wastewater treatment facilities. There are two ways the Environmental Protection Act does this. Number one, companies receive heavy fines, which means very expensive fines, if they release harmful chemicals into rivers. Number two, the government works with private companies to build wastewater treatment facilities around the UK so that it becomes easier and cheaper for companies to treat their waste. As a result, the river quality in the UK has improved significantly compared to even 20 years ago. So the Environmental Protection Act, as you can see, is a very effective law in the UK for improving our environment. And finally, transport. Lorries are some of those polluting vehicles in the world. I don't know if you've ever been in a car behind a lorry and you see it accelerate. Sometimes you see the black smoke coming out of the back. Well, in the UK, we have some of the most modern lorries because of environmental laws. But there's something else we can do. Most people live in cities. And most lorries go to cities because that's where the customers are. So, the way that you can force companies to reduce the environmental impact of transportation is by forcing them to buy and use the most environmentally friendly lorries, the ones that release the fewest harmful chemicals. This can be because they have the most modern engines, or because they are electric. One really important example of this is used in London. It's called the ultra-low emissions zone. In the centre of London, unless you are a super clean electric lorry or very modern lorry that releases almost no harmful chemicals, you have to pay £100 every time you drive into the centre of London. For a big manufacturing company, this becomes extremely expensive very quickly, which means that the manufacturing company has a reason to invest in the cleanest lorries, the most modern lorries that release the fewest harmful chemicals. Otherwise, it would pay a lot of money to go into London every time, which means its profits would be eliminated. The other law that helps to reduce air pollution is called the Clean Air Act. That was one of the ones that was involved in reducing the amount of fossil fuels in the UK. But it also has reduced the number of polluting vehicles that transport goods around the UK. This famous example, called the ULEZ in London, has made the city's air pollution levels decrease significantly because there are far fewer dirty lorries driving through the city, releasing chemicals into the air. This is the story of the UK's battle against environmental pollution from industry. And as you should be able to see, it has been far more effective than what has been achieved in Nigeria, because those laws are more strongly enforced. So that even though the UK has quite a few manufacturing companies, those same companies have much less of an environmental impact on the rivers, on the air, on the sea, and on the land. Okay, time to assess your learning. Please write 1 to 15, read the paragraphs and put the words in the gaps. Go for it. Manufacturing is a highly energy-intensive sector. This means that unless a factory uses 100% renewable energy, manufacturing will have a large carbon footprint due to the burning of fossil fuels, for example coal or natural gas for electricity. In LICs and NEEs, manufacturing leads to high levels of air, waste and water pollution. The UK has several important environmental laws that reduce the amount of pollution industry can produce. These laws are enforced, which means that if they are broken, a business will be punished. An important example is the Environmental Protection Act made in 1990. This forces companies to recycle their waste, filter the gases that leave their factories to reduce air pollution, and treat their wastewater before it goes into rivers. Additionally, the UK tries to reduce the environmental impact of transportation. For example, London's ULEZ, Ultra Low Emissions Zone, makes less efficient vehicles like older lorries pay £100 each time they enter the city. This encourages businesses to use less polluting transportation. A car company called Jaguar is an example of how environmental laws encourages industry to reduce its environmental impact. Renewable energy supplies 30% of their electricity, and they recycle 90% of their waste. Please give yourselves a mark out of 15. If you got any of these wrong or didn't understand any, go back to the explanations and watch it again. Okay, time to really embed your learning. The most powerful way to learn something is to be able to explain it in your own words, to practice. I'm going to show you some questions, answer them using your understanding from this lesson, and then mark your answers afterwards. Go for it. Okay, number 1. Suggest 3 types of negative environmental effect caused by manufacturing. So 1 for each of those. 2. Explain why being energy intensive means manufacturing may contribute to global warming. Fossil fuels, CO2, greenhouse effect, global warming. 3. 2 ways that the UK's environmental laws could reduce the environmental impact of industry. So 4 marked, you needed 2 well-explained points. Any of these examples you needed. So for example, the Clean Air Act, air pollution, power stations, fines them. For example, Jaguar, 30% from solar power. Environmental Protection Act encourages recycling. Jaguar recycles 90% of its waste and it reuses it. More efficient use of transport. ULEZ in London, £100 per day. Forces companies to pay for wastewater treatment, which reduces water pollution in rivers. Give yourselves a mark out of 9. Make sure that you add in green any mistakes that you've got or any parts that you missed. That's really important to improve next time. Watch this video so that you understand the idea of recycling in the UK in more detail. It's a very interesting one. Based on the previous lesson's questions that you've written from memory, test yourselves now to see if you know their answers without checking. Thank you so much for joining me for this lesson. Next lesson, we are going to look at the UK's population. The people in the UK are not spread out evenly. In some parts of the UK there are many people, and in other parts there are very few. I'm going to show you why this is a problem and why it has happened. Join me then. Well done.